Welcome, everyone. This is the inaugural Live from the Field event. In this series, we'll be taking you on virtual field trips to research sites across the world. Today, we're visiting 3 biological field stations, places where people from all backgrounds come together to study the environment. And we're going to be traveling to stations in Florida, California, and Arizona to talk with researchers studying fire across the continent. Fire is increasing in many ecosystems due to climate change. The researchers we're meeting today are studying how fire and how changes in fire are affecting different ecosystems. Each researcher has prepared an 8-minute video outlining some of their fire research. And after these 3 videos, they'll all be available to answer your questions live. I'm really going to encourage everyone to post your questions under the Q&A button as we go along, and also during the Q&A session. So our first video is from Archbold Biological Station, where I work. It's located in the Florida Scrub in Central Florida. Fire is the prevalent ecosystem process in the Florida Scrub, and the Archbold Field Station is home to many fire-adapted species. Dr. Eric Menges joins us today to discuss fire effects on plant population dynamics.
Hi, welcome to sunny Florida. My name is Eric Menges. I've been the plant ecologist at Archbold Biological Station for over 30 years. And here we are at Archbold Biological Station in a beautiful example of Florida scrub. So ecologists have known for a long time that plants of the Florida scrub are very good at resprouting after fire. These palmettos here and these oaks each have their own ways that they resprout and repopulate the area. We're standing in an area here that burned about 1 year ago. So we know this resprouting trait is very important to the recovery of this ecosystem. But I wanted to ask the question, what were the limits of fire intensity that might suppress resprouting and cause these plants to die? And I'd finished another project that looked at frequency of fire, and this project I'm going to talk about today looks at the temperatures of the fire, the heat of the fire. And what we did is we did over a dozen fires where we marked individual plants, and in addition we used these data loggers here which would measure the temperature of the fire every 2 seconds. There's a lead here, and we would bury the data logger itself at the base of the plant with these leads coming out, and we can measure temperatures. We can program this to measure temperatures every 2 seconds. And then we can look at the maximum temperature in the fire, and we can look at the amount of time that the temperature is elevated, called residence time. And those are the 2 variables we expected to affect the abilities of the plants to resprout and grow after fire. Well, what did we find from this project? When we crunched the numbers, we found that the maximum temperature that the fire reached did not affect resprouting percentages or growth. We also found that the residence time, the number of minutes there is a heat pulse, did not affect resprouting or growth. These plants here as a whole had over 90% survival with the fire, very comparable to what you would see without the fire. So they're very well adapted to resprouting after the fire. Our research did show differences among the species. So these palmettos here are particularly strong resprouters with high percentages surviving and really rapid growth, compared to some of the oaks that take a little bit longer to reach, say, the size they were before the fire. So the implications of this are that fires can be as hot as you want and as frequent as you want, and you'll still get the resprouting of these oaks and palmettos and dominant shrubs, which frees the land managers to tailor fire to species that don't resprout, that are more sensitive to, for example, how often the burn is applied. Archbold land managers and scientists have been involved with fire for a long time. The first prescribed burns here were in the mid-1970s, and every year now the land managers and their crews burn hundreds of acres in different parts of this biological station. So you might be wondering how we accomplish the fire treatments. And I work with our land manager, Kevin Main, who was burning different areas in order to manage the property for conservation and for safety. And in those areas where I knew he was going to burn, then I could set up transects and look at the plants. The process of doing the prescribed burning takes a lot of people and a lot of planning, and it's very complex, but the result is a healthier ecosystem that's periodically burned. So when the land managers on burn day have to get ready for the fire, they gather people together and they have a briefing with what to expect and how to deal with different contingencies. And the prep before the fire may involve mowing the edges of the fire in order to be able to start the fire better and to control it, and cutting down snags that might provide long distance sparks that might create spots outside the burn unit. While the fire crew is involved with getting set up, the research crew is also going out to the site, programming those hobo data loggers and installing them, and then often helping with the fire. After the fire, then we return and pick up the data loggers and score the areas of whether they were burned or not in order to figure out the effects of the fire on resprouting. Interns get a great fire experience here at Archbold. They participate on prescribed burns, and it gives them a great background in fire behavior and fire effects. And then many of their independent research projects explicitly look at how aspects of fire affect the response of plant communities or the individual species that they're interested in. So there's a lot of different ways fire research could go here in the Florida scrub. One interesting thing to look at that hasn't been looked at very much is how the ability to resprout depends on carbon storage in plant roots and rhizomes. They store this material as starch, and probably the amount of starch that's stored is going to affect how vigorous the response is. Another thing that needs to be looked at is the interaction of ecological processes and animals in the vegetation recovery. And one thing we've noticed is that after fire, the resprouting shoots are grazed quite a bit more by mammals like deer than the shoots that are growing up in between fires. So there may be some interesting interactions to look at with fire and other organisms and other processes in the Florida scrub. We can also take advantage of new technologies to understand more about fire. Already at Archbold, we use drones to map the extent of fire and the intensity of fire across large landscapes. And this provides data that would just be too time-consuming to collect on the ground. And so a lot of the research at Archbold on fire and other kinds of research can be scaled up to the larger landscape using drone technology and other advances. Well, I appreciate you joining me here in Florida to look at fire in the Florida scrub, and I look forward to your questions.
So now we're going to travel all the way across the country to the grasslands of Central California. Fire's always been part of these grasslands, but with climate change, fire frequency and fire intensity has been going up. Pepperwood Preserve is a 3,200 acre nature preserve that has burned repeatedly since 2017. Michelle Halber, the preserve ecologist, will be talking with us today about how they're monitoring post-fire grassland recovery. Please bear with us a little bit on the background wind noise with this video. We're learning how to do this better. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Michelle Halber, and I'm the preserve ecologist with Pepperwood. Pepperwood is a nonprofit organization committed to excellence in conservation science and education. We're really a place where the community and scientists come together to address some of our most pressing environmental challenges. And one of the greatest things about Pepperwood is, as a nonprofit, we privately own a 3,200 acre nature preserve in the heart of the Mayacamas mountain range, which is part of the intercoastal mountain system of California. And as you can tell, we're in the middle of summer right now, and everything is really, really dry. This is very typical of a Mediterranean ecosystem, where summertime, with summer drought and heat, a lot of our plants go dormant. Similar as you might see in other more temperate areas where plants and animals go dormant in winter. We actually go dormant in summer. So because of the windy conditions, we're doing this next portion at a different location, and I'm sorry about the sound quality. But as a field ecologist, you take what you can get. You know, your field conditions sometimes are really hot, exposed, dry, wet, you name it. We see it all. So I'm technically the preserve ecologist at Pepperwood, and my job is really diverse. I'm a vegetation ecologist by training. I have a bachelor's in plant biology with a focus in ecology and evolution, and a master's in conservation genetics. But here at Pepperwood, I get to do everything from vegetation ecology work to working with wildlife in our wildlife camera program. I have volunteer projects like plant phenology, herpetofauna coverboard surveys. I get to monitor forests, chaparral, which is scrublands, grasslands, you name it. And I get to work with experts in lots of different fields from lots of different sectors. So I'm never not learning. So growing up as a kid, my family didn't go to college, and we never really spoke about college at the dinner table. When I graduated from high school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I went to the local junior college for a couple of years and ended up just kind of traveling, enjoying my young 20s. And in my mid-20s, I decided to go back to school and to focus on plant biology. And I'm really glad I did. I had to put myself through school, though, so it was really challenging. I had to, get lots of scholarships and work jobs and internships all the while. But it was all worth it because I met a lot of different people along the way, networked with them, and, I tell students especially, it's really important to nurture your relationships because those people one day may be your employer. You're getting ready for your career now. You're in your career now. And so treat your education as such. So one of the things we do at Pepperwood is we think of ourselves as a sentinel site. This concept where we're on the watchtower, monitoring how our upland terrestrial Mediterranean ecosystems are changing under this climate change regime, as well as how is it changing under our disturbances that we apply for our management program. So one of the biggest things we need to do is just get out there and collect baseline data. What do we have here, right? We need to get our equipment out on the preserve. We need to get our transects laid down, our plots out there, and document the species compositions that are here. Document the air temperature, the soil moisture, all of those environmental factors that are changing now and through time. When I first started here in 2011, the preserve manager had a priority of setting up a grassland monitoring program because we do so much grazing in that system. And you may not be aware, but grassland as an ecosystem requires some form of disturbance to stay grassland, whether it's grazing or fire or some other disturbance. If you don't disturb it, you get shrub encroachment, which you can actually see to the side here. We have shrubs moving into our grassland, and that area that you're seeing right now is in an exclosure where we don't allow cattle, and so we're seeing the shrubs move in. And that's kind of a common ecological theory called succession. But since grassland monitoring was a priority, I developed a program that we've now been monitoring for 10 seasons. And little did we know, in the 9 years I've been working here, we would have a historic drought, 2 historic wet years, and now 2 historic wildfires within 2 years. So thank goodness we laid out our monitoring project right away, got baseline data, because now we have really interesting questions we can ask about how all of these disturbances are impacting our grassland ecosystem. So one of our main questions with regard to our annual monitoring of our grasslands is, how are our grassland communities changing over time, given climate change and our adaptive management? There you go. This is basically a meter tape that we lay down on these permanent transect locations, and we come back to these same sites year after year and monitor the same space. The design I have, we have 32 transects across our preserve that kind of capture the variability of climate variables and environmental variables. Slope, aspect, climatic water deficit, soil type, as well as plant community type. So basically what I do at each of these quadrats is I look from the top down and take what we call ocular estimates of percent cover. So from the top down, how much cover does each group of plants, like annual grasses, perennial grasses, or maybe even each individual species, Medusa head, which is actually this exotic invasive grass that we do a lot of prescribed burning to control. And by looking top down, I can just make an estimate. Is it 1% cover, 5% cover? What does it look like? We also take information on how deep these fuels are, because these are considered fine fuels, by measuring the depth of the grasses and the thatch layer that builds up over time. And we've actually seen with our grazing program, as well as with the fires, you get a reduction in thatch over time. However, following a fire, because there's such a productive burst of fresh material that comes up, there's a lot of material left behind. And so you can rebuild your thatch layer and go back to business as usual the second season following a fire. So this project wasn't set up as a post-fire grassland monitoring project. However, science is not a linear process, which is one of the questions we were asked to address. It's an iterative process. Especially in field ecology, disturbances like wildfire happen totally unexpectedly. And you have to learn how to maneuver and reframe questions and really get innovative. Those are unique opportunities and opportunities to explore questions that you didn't have on the outset or development of your project. So one of the ways that we have modified is we had to do more sampling. We had to come out right after the fire. We've also collaborated with local researchers that are doing work on nutrient movement through the soil column following a fire. So drawing upon the expert, information and knowledge base that's out there so we can advance our research here locally. So I hope you learned a little something today. Thanks for joining us, and check out Pepperwood online. If you're ever in California and it's not a pandemic, we'd love to have you come see what we're all about. Take care.
We're going to take our last trip to the forests of northern Arizona. Frequent fires in Arizona are converting forests to shrubland unless foresters replant with trees. The Southwest Experimental Garden Array is an elevational series of highly instrumented field sites. And the researchers there are studying tree genetics to figure out which trees have the best chance of surviving, even though the climate is changing. And Professors Amy Whipple and Kristen Waring will present genetic considerations for post-fire restoration. Again, I'll give you a little heads up. Please bear with us with the background wind noise. We are getting better at this. And the other thing is great to have all these student questions coming in. As you type them into the Q&A, put the word student at the beginning, and then we'll be able to prioritize your questions for the panel. So over to the video. Thanks.
Hello, my name's Amy Whipple. I'm an associate professor of biology at Northern Arizona University. And early in my career, it was field experiences that really got me excited about going into my current field, which is evolutionary ecology, instead of veterinary science. So I am really excited to share these experiences with a diverse set of students. From there, I went on and got my degree at UC Davis in population biology. And during that time, I did a lot of work out at the University of California's Bodega Marine Laboratory. Now I focus on studying how plants might respond evolutionarily to climate change. And particularly relevant for today, fire here in Flagstaff several years ago that burned 15,000 acres on the San Francisco peaks, happened right in my backyard. And that really reminds me every day how climate change is increasing fire frequency and severity, and also changing what landscape and what trees might return after fire.
Hi, I'm Kristen Waring, and I'm a professor of forestry at Northern Arizona University. I am here today to help talk about a research project that we have, but first I'll give you some background. I got 3 degrees in forestry along the way. I started with a bachelor's in forestry, then studied forest entomology for my master's degree, and silviculture and forest pathology as my PhD discipline. And silviculture is a word that most people don't know right away, but once you understand what it means, it's pretty intuitive. We use science to manage forests in a sustainable manner to meet landowner objectives. And a lot of people just call it applied forest ecology. And what I'm really passionate about is solving complex forest health issues, such as invasive species or climate change, using silviculture so that we can all have forests and trees to enjoy for the long term. What we study out here on these sites is southwestern white pine. It's a native tree species to the southwestern United States, so it grows in Arizona, New Mexico, southern Colorado, parts of Texas, and then most of its range is actually south of the US border in Mexico temperate forests. So this species tends to be really susceptible to a non-native tree pathogen called white pine blister rust. This non-native disease came into the United States in the Northwest on native tree seedlings that we brought in from Europe. And so we brought this disease in, and it's caused a lot of decline and dieback in related tree species. We do have it in southwestern white pine in the United States, and so we're very concerned about the future of the species because of the disease. We're also very concerned about climate change because in the Southwest the climate is changing very rapidly. One of the effects of climate change in the Southwest is a longer fire season, which leads to higher severity fires in a lot of areas, especially when it interacts with our past management strategies, which have left forests really conducive to high severity fire events. Our forests tend to be on mountains separated by deserts. So if we have one single fire event on a mountainside, it can take out most or all of the entire population of that species on that mountain. So we're concerned not just for southwestern white pine, but for all of the species that live in those forests on those mountains. So that's why we're doing this research today, and for the last 5 years we've been working on this because we're trying to find ways for managers to identify trees that are going to have the genetics that we want to plant out into the future forest.
Our primary research question is whether there is genetic stock anywhere in that entire range from Mexico to southern Colorado that will help the tree survive in various conditions going forward under climate change. To answer that question, we're using what's called a common garden study, where we take seeds from the entire range of southwestern white pine and we plant them all in one place. This box here is a planting box with 100 seedlings planted in it, and these seedlings came from all over the US, part of the range of southwestern white pine. We have repeated this across 3 different elevations that have very different climates so that we can see how things do under different temperatures. In addition to that temperature manipulation, we also wanted to see how they would do under drier and wetter conditions. So we have other boxes where we have rainout shelters installed, and these are plexiglass pieces here that intercept some of the rainfall and shoot it off to the side. And here's a box we planted with trees sourced from Mexico in this very cold site. And what you can see is that we have very low survival here. We only have a few trees out of that 100 surviving. This at first was really shocking to us, a little surprising, a little dismaying, but it turns out that this is high mortality at cold sites for the Mexico trees. It's giving us a lot of insight into how much cold tolerance is needed at these montane sites in Arizona, and which sources of trees might have that. And it tells us we cannot move trees quite that far from Mexico to northern Arizona.
So what we're working on out here is just one piece of a really large collaborative project. And one example of that is we have collaborators working to find resistance to the non-native tree disease, white pine blister rust. So once we've identified those trees that have resistance to the disease and the trees that have tolerances to the future climate, then we can help managers and make recommendations to them on how they can manage not just those trees, but the entire forest. So for example, once we've identified those special trees, we can suggest that managers reduce the fuel loading around them so that they're less likely to die in a catastrophic high severity fire. We can also suggest that they collect cones and seeds and other material called scion from those trees for long-term genetic conservation of that genetic material, but they can also use those seeds to grow out seedlings for reforestation efforts after fires or when we need to restore forests and this species when too many trees die from the non-native pathogen, which we anticipate will happen in the future. Another thing that we can do is couple this with previous research that we've done in the field on seedlings and their survival and growth in the field of the species, so that we can suggest specifically where managers might plant these seedlings for their best shot at growth and survival. Because ultimately what we really want to do is plant seedlings out there that will survive long enough to produce seeds of their own and continue to reforest the forest on their own so that they're sustainable in the long run. So that's our ultimate objective, is to sustain the species in the really long term. And without the big collaborative group that we work with, we wouldn't have had the opportunity to do this with all these seedlings across all these sites. We have an amazing collaborative group of other scientists, dedicated graduate students, undergraduates, volunteers, and staff who have all worked really hard together to make this project.
Thank you all the panelists for preparing those videos. They were a special insight. I'm going to, it's now time to move on to our panel discussion and Q&A. I'm really excited how you've all been posting questions using the Q&A button. Them in the chat, and I encourage you to move them over to that button that says Q&A because it's easier for us to track them. I know our college classes who we invited to attend today have a time constraint of 50 minutes. So we're initially going to give priority to their questions. And after that, we'll answer questions from all the other attendees until the top of the hour. And the panelists are going to try very hard to keep their answers to a minute or less so we can get through some of these great questions. I think, Laura, I'm going to hand over to you to start with the first questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for those great videos, everyone. The first question comes to Eric Menges of Archbold. What is a typical return interval for prescribed burning at Archbold? Do you try to be irregular in intervals?
Well, the return interval depends on the burn unit and the vegetation. So some of the return intervals are as short as 2 to 5 years. Some of them are as long as 60 to 100 years. And they're mixed up in the landscape to provide a great deal of biodiversity, which we think will promote research opportunities and biological diversity. And within those intervals, we do mix it up. So we do not burn any areas of the station at regular intervals. So it creates a lot of nice research opportunities with different fire histories across our property.
Thank you. The next question is for Michelle Halber. Are there prescribed fires at Pepperwood, or does this differ from Archbold in that the fire is observed more naturally?
That's a really good question. For those of you from California, you're probably aware that wildfire is becoming more prevalent, in our coastal systems. Now, we do conduct prescribed fire in our grasslands at Pepperwood. We have done 2 of them, but it's a very complex process. You have a very short window of time where everything comes together. You have to pull in CAL FIRE to do your burn. You have to have permitting. You have to have the right weather. You have to get the Air Quality Control Board's approval. And you're literally on the ground that morning calling people, is it okay to burn? And if you get the thumbs up, then you're allowed to do so. So there's a lot of preparations involved, and a lot of times prescribed burns don't go through. So we have done 2 prescribed burns specifically to control for Medusa head, the annual invasive grass that I showed in this. Now we're really trying to get good fire on the land more regularly in a proper burn interval, as Eric was talking about, which is maybe 50 years, maybe 3 years. It depends on your vegetation. We have a lot of oak woodlands and a rich cultural heritage that gives us a sense of, how frequently we should be burning the landscape. But a big thing that just happened, and it may not have come through in my presentation, is we had 2 wildfires in 2 years. That back-to-back burning may not be really beneficial. So a lot of our monitoring that we're doing across the different vegetation types will be looking into what is an appropriate, burn interval, and when should we as managers start putting fire back on the landscape.
So since this was a comparative question, maybe Eric, we've had decades of prescribed burning experience. Did you want to compare and contrast that answer?
Yes, well, at Archbold, we also get wildfires as well. We're in a lightning capital of North America. So we monitor those wildfires, and we have to adjust the prescribed burning when we get wildfires that cover a lot of area. And so we're in a similar situation to the folks in California, where we have to hold off on our prescribed burning because we've had so much wildfire. We want to maintain a balance of post-fire ages to allow species that like frequent fire and species that don't like frequent fire, to coexist in the landscape.
So I'll ask the next one. And this student started off with saying this is an irrelevant question, and I want to really stress there's no irrelevant questions here, so let's not start off that way. I was wondering if it's better to take actions to try and prevent, or is it better just to let it happen because of the regrowth that follows burning? And I'd like to see if Amy and Kristen could maybe tackle that one first, and then see if anyone else wanted to chip in.
So I guess I can start. For our forests in the Southwest, they're historically adapted to fire. And so if we can get fire back into the landscape on a regular basis that's in line with the historical burn patterns, then that's the most beneficial option. But because of our previous management practices and the changing climate, often what happens now is that the fires are more severe and larger than they were historically, and that results in conditions where the forest doesn't regrow in the same way or at all sometimes. And so hopefully that kind of addressed the question. Amy, do you have anything to add?
I would just say it's that means, so the Forest Service here controls a lot of that land base that we were talking about. And so they have sort of pre-planned in different areas, if this burns, how much do we want to let it go? How much do we want to do back burns? How do we want to try to manage this to get the best benefit for the landscape out of this fire? So they're always trying to balance that, to reintroduce fire, but not overdo it. And I just thought it would, as a nice comparative thing, it would be a nice contrast then to Archbold, where they could burn as much as they wanted and they didn't kill those plants. and that doesn't, that's not, well, okay. Maybe I exaggerated a little bit. Sorry, Hilary, I'll let you. But here, with the current fire intensities, it can be overdone and cause real problems for regrowth.
I don't know, Eric, did you want to add anything to that, or do you think we covered it pretty well?
I think I covered it very well.
Okay.
I would like to add one thing though, because I think Pepperwood's unique in this panel in that we really represent a land base that we are responsible for stewarding and managing. And so we're utilizing the science that we're producing, but also like Amy, Kristen, and Eric are producing to make these decisions. And that to me is a really critical piece. You got to have science-based management decision-making. And for us, we're land managers. So we're out there, we're doing some fire fuels management. Like we're actually cutting trees in our forest. We're thinning Douglas fir, which is a native tree that because of fire suppression is encroaching into our woodlands and killing off some of our most biodiverse forested habitats. So we're actually cutting trees to save the forests. And we're doing that, as we do that, we're kind of serving as a low burning fire, moving through the, the understory, preventing canopy fires. So fires that get up in the canopy that are damaging
slowing fire down. So if wildfire does come through, perhaps CAL FIRE and other firefighters may be able to have gain a foothold and really hold the fire line. And
okay, yeah, that's super. Thank you, Michelle. I'm not going to dwell on this, but Archbold also is a land management. We manage 20,000 acres with the same criteria, so we share that. We share that goal. I'm going to move on to a comparative one, but I'm going to ask Eric to start with this. And that is, how does the resprouting ability of Central California grasslands compare with Florida scrub plants following a wildfire? I know your video somewhat talked about that, but maybe not in great depth, the resprouting ability.
Yeah, the Archbold is dominated by shrublands, and shrubs can have a lot of ground biomass, and I think that's probably in contrast to grasses. The palmettos and oaks can have 4 or 5 times as much biomass below the ground as above ground, and that provides a lot of storage of carbon there that allows out after multiple fires again and again. And it was clearly a good adaptation to recover from any kind of disturbance. And we think, in our area, fire has been what's selected for that strong resprouting ability. And even very small plants can resprout repeatedly after frequent fires. So I think the fact that it's a naturally ecosystem dominated by woody plants with that storage probably makes it different than grasslands.
Okay. Laura?
We have a question for the third presentation, so for the Northern Arizona. How long does it take Western white pine to be reproductively mature? Is it mono or dioecious? Do you have to plant both female and male?
I can answer that one. So it takes, in the field under natural conditions, at least 20 years to be reproductively mature. They are dioecious, so you have both on the same plant, and I might have gotten that backwards.
Monoecious.
Yeah, monoecious. Sorry, I always do that. They do have male and female reproductive structures on the same plant. But what we did was went out and collected from the maternal trees. So we collected the seeds and we grew the seeds out. So what you're looking at, like in the background of my picture here, are seedlings from different maternal trees. So we don't know what the pollinator tree was. So they're half sibs at best.
Okay, thanks. So we're going from a very specific to quite a general question, and I'm going to ask Amy to answer it first, and then Eric, and then Michelle. And if you could do sort of fairly brief answers, that would be great. This is quite a challenging question. Why is wildfire activity been increasing over the years?
Okay, well, in Northern Arizona, I'll answer for, there are at least 3 factors contributing to that. One is the past management strategies that suppressed fire, means that many of our forests are thicker with vegetation and trees than they were previously. 2, climate change has made the climate warmer, given us longer, warm, dry seasons, increasing the fire risk. And then more fire starts from people being in the forest and camping, campfires, making sparks from vehicles, and things like that would be the 3 main factors.
Thank you, Amy. Eric?
Well, in Florida, one of those is also a factor. We have increased ignitions as more and more people move to Florida and burn their trash or leave their car parked on top of dry vegetation. In addition, what we're expecting to see with climate change is longer droughts and also larger rain events, including tropical storms. And what we expect to happen is a lot of abundant growth during the rainy periods, and then a lot of fuel available for intense fires, longer droughts. So those are the predictors of climate change in Florida that could really change the fire regime here.
And Michelle, your thoughts?
Everything you guys said, really, there's the three-pronged, the triangle, the fire triangle, which is your fuels, your weather, and your ignition source. And so with fire suppression, we have greater amount of fuels. With climate change, we have more arid conditions, but those wet spring months can bring up a lot more growth and become, fuels later on in the season. And then there's a lot more people in California moving into the wildland urban interface, and there's homes everywhere. So there's a real risk to human, lives and infrastructure, which is unfortunate.
Laura?
Great. So I have another question for all. I'll start with Eric. Who approves the prescribed fires and how are they started?
The Florida Forestry Service is in charge of that, and our land manager writes the plan and then gets permission from them to burn. And most of our fires are started with the drip torches that you saw in the video, but certainly other agencies in Florida use other techniques, throwers and dropping ping pong balls from planes to burn large areas. The ping pong balls, when they hit the ground, mix two kinds of chemicals that start the fires.
Interesting. Is that pretty much the same, Michelle, at Pepperwood?
Yeah, so we collaborate with CAL FIRE to conduct our burns because they assume liability, which is a big issue out here in California with a lot of neighbors. And they use drip torches, depending on the size of the fire. Sometimes they'll actually use like a projectile drip torch that when they launch it, it drips burning fuel to get a nice strip. And it just depends on the prescription you're looking for, how fast you want the fire to move, how tall you want the fire to be. So like with controlling Medusa head, we want the fire to concentrate a couple feet off the ground to really kill off those seeds in that plant. And they can do all of that because they are the fire experts.
Excellent. Anything else to add, Kristen?
Well, we don't manage, we're professors and not fire managers. The Forest Service does a lot of prescribed burning in Arizona, and they're very careful about their burn windows and the burn prescription to make sure that they can control fires once they start them. And they use a variety of the same techniques just described.
I'll just add that we have a prescribed fire going on at Archbold, and today Eric and I can't be on the backup team because we're on this Zoom call. So here's a question for all of you. What were some of the most challenging difficulties associated with setting up experiments for the study? And I'm going to suggest we start with Amy and then maybe move to, Kristen could add, then Eric and Michelle. How does that sound?
Okay. So I think probably the biggest challenges, of course, while working in Mexico, I don't know, there's a lot with this one because it's big. Working in Mexico and getting seed collections from Mexico, we worked with Mexican collaborators to facilitate that and to do that. We couldn't have done that on our own. And then planting these sites, these sites you see in the pictures behind Kristen, these are remote sites on the North Rim. They're far away. They're far away from basically any town. So getting everything there, getting the equipment there, getting the seeds there, getting the water there, it's all a lot of work. And so that's actually our pictures, our original pictures were from a test site where we practiced everything before we went and did it on the North Rim.
Mm-hmm. Kristen?
Yeah, I will back that the remoteness of the field sites lent a lot of logistical challenges to the project, including now when we've been up and running for a while. We actually had a wildfire start that made it really difficult to get up and water the seedlings in the last couple of weeks. The field crew had to meet a Forest Service escort to get into the fire closure area so that we could maintain the seedlings and so they wouldn't die. So a fire again played a role and created a challenge for us.
Thank you. And I'm watching our time because I know the students I'll have to leave very soon. So I'm going to give Eric a minute and then Michelle a minute to add to this if you would like to.
Well, Archbold's a really convenient place to do research. There's a lot of advantages. I think the hardest part of this particular project was we had to put out the data loggers just before the fires, and often
sometimes the fires didn't happen for one reason or another, and sometimes 80% of the burn unit got burned and our data loggers didn't get burned. That's kind of Murphy's Law of trying to conduct fire monitoring research.
Mm-hmm. And Michelle?
So because our site is actively managed, balancing the management with cattle or other disturbances we use and tools we use with the needs of the research can be challenging. So for instance, communicating when cows can be there or can't be there can sometimes get missed. Young calves like to go past exclusionary fencing. And then also a challenge for nonprofits is trying to get sustained funding for these kinds of really critical long-term ecological monitoring projects. It's not as glamorous as some research projects, and yet they're very critical for some of these long-standing questions that we have.
Thank you for that comment. And at this point, I'm going to say, I know the students are at the end of their allotted 50 minutes, although of course you're welcome to stay. And we're going to keep on answering questions up to the top of the hour. There's been some great questions. I want to thank you all. And just to let the students who have to leave now, we'll be emailing follow-ups with you, and we'll keep in touch with you. So thank you for joining us. And I'd like to move on to another question. And there's really two parts to this. The first part is for you, Michelle. And then the other part is a question we get all the time at Archbold. So I'd like to ask all of us. So the first part of the student's question. If the goal is to remove invasive grass species and they used fire to do that, was burning the only method or are there other methods? So hold that thought. And then for all of you, I'm sure you've had this before, doesn't burning release too much toxic gases like CO2 into the air? So we'll come to the second question after Michelle's addressed the first one. Is burning the only way you can do this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer just bluntly is no. There's lots of tools that we can utilize. And, depending on your goals, your objectives, you may pick different tools. Fire has benefits for other things. So if you are using fire to control invasive weeds, you also get the benefits of nutrients being released, supporting some of those wildflowers that prefer fire or take advantage of fire. We also use timed grazing. You can do mowing, and you can use herbicides, of course, as a plant management tool. We tend not to try to use herbicides just because of the toxicity effects that are potential. But that was a great question. There's a lot of tools that are being investigated out there.
Thank you. And so who would like to start on the question, doesn't fire release a lot of toxic gases like CO2? Eric is volunteering. Go for it.
Well, it's true. There's a large CO2 release with an individual fire. But as we've seen in these ecosystems, the plant recovery is very fast. And in Florida scrub, the regrowth is much faster than the growth you get without a fire. And that regrowth is sucking out CO2 from the atmosphere. So that the follow-up question to that would be, over different fire cycles that are different lengths of time, what's the net CO2 release or the net CO2 absorption? And oftentimes, with the proper burn interval, it balances out.
Thank you. Amy or Kristen?
The use of fire in the Southwest is really preventative to keep the catastrophic high severity fire potential lower, and that's what our ecosystems were adapted to primarily. We're low in fires on a more frequent basis, and so when you calculate the carbon release from these prescribed fires versus the alternative, which is a high severity event, the carbon release is actually less, even with frequent prescribed burning.
Okay, I have another question for Eric and Kristen. I think Eric found the severity of fire did not affect the resprouting, but Kristen said that larger and more severe fires are affecting regrowth. Does that have to do with the vegetation at play, or am I not understanding this right? Eric?
That's a really good question. I think you are understanding it right. But certain plants are able to tolerate fires of different severity. And so that's one thing land managers can sometimes take care of by creating a fire that's severe enough to reduce, say, something like these mesic forest trees, but not severe enough to kill the grass. That would be the example from out west. So I think there's a lot of variation in individual species ability and different ecosystems ability to deal with fires of different severities.
Yeah, and for us, if we want the conifer trees to regrow, which is what we really focus on, the footprint of the fire matters. So if you have a really large area that burns at high severity, there's really no seed source for the conifers to come back in within a reasonable time period. And so what we end up with are grass-dominated systems or shrub-dominated systems instead of the conifer forest that was there previously.
Thank you. I'm going to ask this question of all of you because I don't want to miss it, and I'm watching over at 2:54 and I would like to be wrapping up in 3 minutes or 4 minutes. The question was, how can an undergraduate get involved in, well, the question was the last project, but I would actually like to ask it for all of you. What's the opportunities for undergraduate or recent graduates to get involved in projects? Michelle, do you want to start that one?
Yeah, so we are considered a field station that is open to outside researchers. And, you know, if you're considering a master's or PhD project, or even a senior thesis, we are a field site that is available, and you would just need to contact someone with a request. But we also have a lot of internships and, you know, collaborations with various universities in the region. And if you are interested in doing this kind of work, you know, just, I would start asking around. Look at whether or not your state has a reserve system you can tap into. There's lots of ways to get involved. And the first way is really just starting to ask questions and connecting with the experts in the field you're interested in.
So Amy?
So I just, into the question on the box, I put in a link to our research experience for undergraduates program, which is a great way for undergraduates from other institutions to get involved, because you can apply to a summer internship program where you come here and work with us in the summer. And Kristen Waring and I are not the only mentors in that program, but we are two of the mentors in that program. And programs like that are great for getting involved in these kinds of studies. But also you can just email the researcher who you're interested in working with directly and see what opportunities they might have, because they might have some other funding sources and some opportunities for you to come and get involved.
All right, thanks everybody.
I'm actually going to add a little point here that I thought I'd bring an additional perspective. Getting involved in fire ecology doesn't just mean you're someone that can carry a drip torch and tolerate really high heat and humid conditions. There's so much work involved. There's work from, you know, preparing the spatial analysis, the mapping, the data crunching, you know, organizing behind the scenes. You don't need to actually even be here for a fire. Drone pilots, you name it. So I wanted to encourage everyone not to think about this as just something where one has to be a sort of at the front of the field conducting it. There are so many opportunities to get involved in fire ecology research, from the comfort of your office to the heat and smoke of a fire. So please remember that when you're thinking about asking about fire ecology opportunities. Now it is 2:57, and I did promise that I would sort of wrap up at this point, because I know and there are so many other great questions. I feel bad we didn't get to them. So I'm going to say, first of all, thank you to all our speakers, to Eric Menges, Michelle Halber, Amy Whipple, and Kristen Waring. Thank you all very much. Thank you to the Organization of Biological Field Stations and everyone behind the scenes who made this possible. This was our first ever go, and we're going to get better and better at these.